Yeah, it's interesting. This, web giants and social media platforms doing this kind of self, policing themselves and censoring stuff and taking things down. And I'm just wondering whether,
Hello and welcome to another Telecoms.com podcast. I think I'm giving up counting how many weeks we are into it. But obviously we're still locked down, as you can see from everyone's exotic backgrounds. We've got the usual crew of Ian and Jamie. We're a little bit late this time, recording on a Monday rather than a Friday because reasons that I won't bore you with, but they're not very exciting. And so I'll just crack into it, but we've obviously got a full week and a bit stuff to review. I think we're going to start with a look at Nokia. Our most read story on Telecoms.com last week was Nokia getting a little bit of work in China. And today, on Monday, our lead story is about is another Nokia one. So that seems like a good one to start. As ever, Huawei was front and center of the telecoms news, mainly in the Americas last week. There were some developments in Canada, which obviously, whether it likes it or not, is right in the middle of the Huawei drama, thanks to the CFO being arrested there. God, what was it, 18 months ago, something like that. And so we'll talk about that and also something going on in Brazil. And then lastly, only because, to defend myself here, only because the other guys didn't suggest anything, I'm going to talk about my favorite bugbear of social media censorship and regulation and all that jazz. And so expect to see Jamie and Ian sort of roll their eyes as I bang on about my little obsession. So just to remind you that if you're watching this on the site or on YouTube or on Facebook, you can also listen to it on iTunes, SoundCloud, Spotify, and countless other podcasting platforms. Right. So Nokia is what we're going to start with. I'm going to hand over to you first, Ian, because I assume from our chat, forgive me if I'm wrong, that you also covered the story I did last week about them getting a little bit of 5G work in China. Is that right, mate?
I did, yeah. I did.
Yeah, go.
It seems like a distant memory now, so...
Yeah, okay, well...
Details, but...
you can give us the sort of senile recollection version.
Try and get the right Chinese operator.
Yeah, okay, so you go ahead and I'll help you out if I think you need it.
It is Unicom, isn't it?
I believe it was, yes.
It is Unicom, yeah. So the bit of news last week was that having sort of cocked up in the 5G radio market in China and not been able to land any work when the big contracts were being handed out for whatever reason, geopolitics possibly one of the reasons. The other being just their sort of perceived lag, I think, on sort of 5G product development. They did have a little bit of a comeback last week in the core market and managed to pick up a bit of work with Unicom in that area, where I think they've always been a bit stronger anyway. They haven't sort of been, bedeviled with these reports about product problems in that particular market, and that all obviously falls under the umbrella of their software business, which is also doing quite well, I think, if you look at it next to the rest of Nokia. But it's pretty small what they got. I mean, I think it's about 10% share of the work that Unicom gave out in the core. So again, I don't know. I didn't see a breakdown of where the rest of the 90% went, but I'm assuming that it probably all went to Huawei and ZTE. And if not all to those two, then there's probably some kind of tiny other Chinese company involved. So, in one way, it's not less than, it's sort of comparable to Ericsson's share of the China mobile radio contract. But it's very, very different affair because you can make a huge amount of money in a, market like China that's as big as that in radio, where there's, hundreds of thousands of base stations being erected and billions of dollars being spent. Core just isn't like that. It's just a much, much smaller deal. I think the forecasts that I tend to trust on all this come from Del Oro, simply because the vendors seem to use those for their own forecasting. And I think they reckon the core market's worth about 8 billion annually. I think radio is something like 30. So it's a big difference. And, if you're only getting a 10% share with one operator, then, it's not going to kind of turn Nokia around strategically, but it's better than nothing. And I suppose it could lead to other things. I think that's one of the reasons people are trying to get into the 5G market. I mean, 5G core market. Obviously, there's a lot of changes happening as that technology gets rolled out, and it could, who knows, it could lead on to other stuff for them. So it can't be termed bad news. It's just not. It's good as winning a radio deal, basically.
It needs to be kept in perspective. I mean, I thought the biggest significance of it was more sort of symbolic. So, like Reading and Telecoms.com have both, and on this podcast, we've spoken about the demise of Nokia in China. I think, Ian, you might have been especially strident in your writing about saying that they're basically not in China anymore. So for them, this is sort of their way. I'm sure it wasn't just with you in mind that they made the deal, but this is sort of their way of going, you see, we are still in China a bit. So,
well, that's blown it out of proportion a little bit as well. Because you think, but you can't forget that Nokia is not a mobile-only player, and you actually look at its broadband and cloud and data center business. It's basically in bed with all of the hyperscalers and these massive cloud players. So, for instance, Tencent, Baidu, Alibaba, it's a major supplier for data center interconnect and the broadband solutions. So mobile is not doing fantastically, but that's pointed to, you've said that before, with their products being more expensive thanks to this gate array. What is it? Field programmable gate array, FPGA, or whatever it is.
Yeah.
And basically, and the software in the back end, I've heard, isn't quite as good. I think that's what the problems they were suffering with at the very beginning with T-Mobile. If that's not correct, I don't think it ever was officially confirmed, but their base stations weren't working at the beginning. If I can't remember if that's correct, is it not, Ian? You're still on mute.
Sorry. Yeah. I was just going to say before we go on to that, on the other stuff that you were mentioning, the data. And that's true that they have optical and broadband and core as well, obviously. So yeah, I was quite strident, Scott, but I think I was fairly fair in saying it was just 5G radio that they kind of.
I certainly would never suggest you're otherwise, mate.
The only thing about all that other stuff is that they haven't actually been doing very well. If you look at their accounts, both Ericsson and Nokia, you actually have to go into annual reports, I think, in Ericsson's case, because they just call it North Asia or something, but they do break it out in the annual report. And Ericsson's China business has been, I think, getting slightly bigger each year for the last 3 years, and Nokia's has been shrinking. So they have all this other stuff, they have all this optical. And actually, one of the reasons they did quite badly in the first quarter, they had that 200 million hit. It was all to do with China, optical and broadband. That's where the slowdown came. Now, I know that might be components related. It was blamed on COVID-19 and all this, but they've not done very well in some of the other areas that they're in. That's the problem. So and this is what they're saying, we're not in radio anymore, but we can try and make up for that by winning more optical business, and we can try and win more core business, and we can try and do all this other stuff. But they've got to kind of show they're doing that, because at the moment the trend's not been that good. And then on the base station side, sorry, what was the question again? Totally forgotten now. It's compatibility with.
He was asking about some early missteps that were reported.
Yeah, so they're problems that which kind of relates to the announcement they've come out with today about jobs, but we'll get onto that. But they basically chose to use what are called field programmable gate arrays. I think I always get it wrong, but I think that's
that was what Jamie was just talking
about. Which are sort of components that you can tweak and fiddle with. I think give you more flexibility. You can customize them afterwards and stuff, but they're quite expensive, so they really chewed into profit margins. And the perception was they didn't actually say we weren't very competitive with them, but they were clearly having a cost problem with them, and they've decided to phase them out and go for these application-specific integrated circuits, which is what Huawei and Ericsson are using. But that's taking a long time. They don't expect to complete that transition until the end of 2022. And that's one of the main reasons that they've had this big problem with margins. Ericsson's done very well under Ecom of becoming profitable again, and they've done a good job on the product side. They've got the R&D sorted out. They've made a lot of cuts to jobs, but they're very mobile focused now. And everything seems to be going in the right direction. Now, I know they've flagged that there might be a bit of margin pressure in China this quarter, but it's nothing that would really sort of alarm you looking at the trajectory over the last couple of years. Whereas Nokia has been really struggling. I think they're, barely breaking even, and a lot of it to do with this kind of misstep on the product.
Yeah, and the more I reflect on it, the more I think it's a really fundamental strategic error. If you go all in, I mean, Nokia for years has been banging on about how it makes its own chips and the other guys don't, and hurrah for that. But if you go all in, I mean, you basically got two choices. It seems, I'm sure it's a lot more complicated than this, but from my dilettante perspective, you got two choices of chip strategy: FPGA or ASIC. And they went, yeah, definitely FPGA. And it's turned out they should have gone, yeah, ASIC. So that's a sort of binary decision that they got wrong. And it's presumably a contributing factor to the Nokia dude calling it a day.
They also blamed it on a supplier. It wasn't just the higher costs, should say. It was also, they said they were let down by one of their key suppliers. Like they had some delays that were kind of out of their control. They didn't actually name them, but
bad workman blames his tools and all that.
They didn't name the supplier, but a bunch of analysts did and said it was Intel. So yeah,
Intel in dropping the ball on chip supply. Shock. Just ask Apple about that.
But the problem they've got now is this. They need to put more money into R&D basically to try and get the 5G product line sorted out and fixed. But at the same time, they've got these other costs they need to cut. They've still,
feel free to move into that story if you want.
Yeah, we can mention the story, which is today's news, that they've announced. I think it's about 1,200, isn't it, Scott? The cuts.
Yeah, 1,233.
1,233 job cuts in France, which is quite a lot. It's about a third, I think, of the Alcatel-Lucent international business in France.
Yeah.
And maybe a fifth or maybe a little bit more than that of the total number of jobs in France. It's quite a lot. Their overall headcount at the moment is about 98,000. It was at the end of 2019. And they cut about 5,000 jobs last year. So it's sort of more of the same. And they did make that clear in the statement. It's kind of, this isn't going to be the only 1,200 jobs that goes at Nokia this year. I'd be very surprised to see that. There's going to be another big raft of cuts, I think, because they've got a lot of work to do on sort of transformation. And they've identified this target of, it used to be 700 million, I think, was their cost-saving target between 2018 and 2020 to get that much out of operating costs. But they've had to lower that to 500, and the reason being that they don't want to damage the 5G business any more than they already have. So they've got to keep spending on that and try and sort that out, and avoid any perception that R&D in 5G is taking any kind of damage at all. But if they do that, if they sort of ring fence that area, then it becomes very difficult then not to make cuts elsewhere, so that R&D suffers. And the R&D trajectory of the company's not been good over the last 3 years. They're the only one, if you look at the big five, so Huawei, Ericsson, Nokia, Cisco, and ZTE, they're the only ones whose R&D budgets sort of markedly dropped in the last 2 years. And they're still spending more as a percentage of sales than Ericsson, but that's partly because their sales performance hasn't been great. So, but the actual absolute amount has come down, and that doesn't look very good these days. We've got Huawei going, we're going to spend 20 billion this year, and we're going to spend whatever it's going to be next year. It's kind of a worry for people who kind of concern about product competitiveness.
And the other thing on this France move, there are a few things that just struck me as slightly odd. Firstly, that they didn't communicate it until Reuters wrote a story about it. Now, I don't know how Reuters got the story. Maybe it was controlled leak. Maybe it was from Nokia. But it still seems like a slightly eccentric way of going about it. If you're going to make an announcement like that, just stick it up on the website, let everyone know, control the information. Their statement that I eventually got off them, and I think you did too, is fairly generic. This is all part of the plan, as you said. But then why not say that from the start? Because we're in an information vacuum. People like us are obviously going to speculate and go, "What's going on? Is this suddenly out of the blue?" The other thing that I thought was interesting, which was covered in the Reuters bit, but not in Nokia's statement, was that there was some kind of moratorium, some kind of commitment from the acquisition of Alcatel-Lucent, apparently, according to the Reuters story, for them to not lay anyone off, which is a not surprising commitment for a company to attach to the acquisition of a sort of national champion. But there was a 5-year limit on it, and it looks like the moment that 5-year limit elapses, they're going to get rid of them. So the question that begs is, was that always the plan, which is probably the more likely thing, or were they kind of hoping to hold on to them, but circumstances have deteriorated such that they're a bit more forced into the move in a sort of overhead cutting way?
I think that I don't know. I mean, I'm a bit sympathetic on that front to them. Things haven't gone very well for them, really, have they, in the last couple of years? I mean, I don't think they've had a great run since that merger was completed, and they wouldn't have wanted to be where they are in 5G at the moment. I mean, the widespread perception in the market right now is that Huawei and Ericsson are kind of way out in front, and Nokia is sort of struggling to look after business. And
it's in 5G, yeah.
Yeah, and it's only because of this issue of interoperability, and we always talk about this in the industry, lock-in and all these things, that I think maybe more operators haven't sort of moved away from them, because it's quite a hard thing to do. It's quite a costly, that whole swap out cost, and taking all your kind of 4G equipment out and moving it to another supplier that's doing your 5G is something you don't want to have to do. This is one of the reasons people don't want to move away from Huawei, obviously, partly because it's very good, but partly that. So,
sorry to butt in, Jamie. You flagged up this sort of Tencent Baidu story, and that's something that you wrote last week. Do you think that's quite a significant move?
I do, because I think this is all about edge computing. I mean, it's about building out new data centers and building out the edge capabilities of these hyperscale cloud players, which is, I mean, in any market, it's going to be massive. But you look at something the size of the US, of China, and it's a big payday. So I mean, what is worth bearing in mind that these are sort of extended agreements which are already in place. But it does depend on the scale of the partnerships, which obviously they didn't release the actual financials of these two agreements, but also how many other vendors have been taken on. I mean, obviously, let's not forget, Huawei is a big player in the sort of the DCI and the optical markets as well. But it's the edge is going to be built out, and that will result in a lot of business for broadband and optical and DCI players in the market. And if Nokia can grow this potential, it just shows that it makes it a bit more of a resilient business. Yes, I think it's never going to. 5G base stations are the big ticket item. But the underlying infrastructure to connect it all, and the cloud and the edge infrastructure to actually complete the 5G ecosystem, I think it's something that it's not overlooked, but it's not given it's a huge amount of attention at the moment, because the world has been torn towards 5G, and quite rightly, 5G is what everyone's spending money on, so that's where the majority of attention should be directed.
Crap. Sorry, guys. My problem is I mute it with a little button on my microphone, so I can't even see on the screen when I do it. Jamie, while we got you on the line and unmuted, you wrote another Nokia story today, not necessarily related to anything we've just spoken about, but seeing as we're chatting about Nokia, we might as well give it a mention. That Nokia's seems to be taking a bit of a lead when it comes to trials of a piece of spectrum called C-band in the States. Do you want to quickly tell us a bit more about that?
Yeah. I mean, you have to be very wary when you talk about sort of like Nokia taking the lead here, because it's not taking the lead; it's rehashing old work. It is fundamentally taking what the Europeans have been doing for years and applying that in the North American markets. They just need to validate the proposition, their technology, against the network, the North American telcos networks, because obviously the tool, you buy a base station, it doesn't just simply slot into a network. There's a lot of work that needs to be done beforehand. So basically the C band is 3.7 to 4.2 gigahertz, which is the sweet spot mid-band spectrum that we've been using basically everywhere else in the world aside from North America. So they're effectively running trials to demonstrate the speed and the coverage and the resiliency and absolutely the handover, how effective it is at doing that between base stations, because they want people to buy their kit when mid-band spectrum becomes available in North America, which might be at the end of this year, might be at the end of next year, might be in 3 years' time, might be in 5 years' time. No one actually knows when it's going to be. There's a big question mark over when they're going to actually access 5G mid-band spectrum.
Okay, cool. Well, I think we covered quite a lot of Nokia stories there. I mean, the thread that seems to sort of persist throughout our stuff when we talk about Nokia is, where are they in terms of regaining their competitiveness, especially in 5G? Where are they in terms of regaining their profitability? There was I had to comment on the Reuters story before I'd got Nokia's statement that they were saying that the reason they did it is because of some kind of cost pressures in the market. And I couldn't help remarking that in itself was a rather redundant statement, because why the hell else would you get rid of thousands of people if you weren't trying to reduce costs? The other interesting thing is to look at Nokia's share price, which actually doesn't seem to have done a lot either way. It was down 1% or 2% last time I looked. Quite often when you make redundancies, perhaps slightly counterintuitively, share price often receives a little bump, because investors sort of think, oh, cool, they're stripping out some inefficiency, stripping out some overhead. That means more profitability. Yay for us investors. But the fact that it went down a little bit could mean nothing. It could just be the way it would have gone if nothing had happened to do with Nokia today. Or it could mean that it's more than offset by what this says to investors about the underlying health of the company, that on top of all the streamlining and cost cutting it's done over the last few years, here's another one, however much they try and insist it's all part of the grand plan. So,
I think
go ahead, Ian.
I was just going to chip in and say, I think that probably investors aren't surprised by the number of cuts here, because so there's about 5,000 cuts, I think, last year, and they've still got this big cost-saving target they're working towards. And you can see from looking at their profit margins that they need to do something. So I think everybody's probably anticipating quite a lot of cuts this year. It's just sort of where they're happening, and maybe that's wary of putting a statement out. It's awkward. It's such a big number in one market, isn't it? To get rid of a third of people at a particular business, and a fifth in the country, and then there's they've kind of had to say it's in R&D, central functions part of it, also R&D. So it does. In a way, it's not surprising they're having to make cuts there, because it's any area. It's hard to ring fence everything when you've got the kind of margin pressure that they're facing. But it's maybe not the sort of thing you want to own up to. And at first, I don't really know what the rules are on this sort of thing. I mean, there are times when companies have to disclose, how many cuts they're making in a market, don't they? They have to sort of put out a regulatory statement, and someone gets hold of that. But in terms of comms with the press, I mean, if you're doing that anyway, like you say, someone's going to pick it up at some point.
So you might as well just
get through. So you might as well get through. I find it, it is a bit, it's a bit silly to try and duck it in a way, I think.
Yeah, I mean, so in the Reuters bit, well, actually, I'll talk about their statement first. Their statement goes, not the usual boilerplate stuff. Nokia is fully committed to supporting impact employees and so on. And there is a consulting process. It says the planned project is subject to consultations with Works Council / employee representatives, and the final outcome will only be known after that process has been concluded, which is fine. So much correct sort of HR due process. But Reuters managed to get hold of a stroppy union person, a union, which I presume is something to do with telecoms in France, a spokesperson said, it's just a low-cost strategy that's being implemented contrary to all the commitments made by Nokia in France. Nokia is laughing at everyone, first and foremost the French government. So
Well,
this is... Go on,
that's where
sorry.
they'll have got the story, isn't it? I suppose that that stroppy union will have been told
Could be.
plans, and then they've gone and spoken to the press. I suspect is how Reuters got it first.
Yeah, that all makes sense. And so that's the challenge they got. If you're laying off people, especially in France, although much of Western Europe, where you've got some quite rigid employment law, in France you've probably got quite rigid employment law. You've got famously stroppy unions who have got no hesitation of going on strike and even smashing shit up if they feel like it. And then you've got this commitment that they made 5 years ago, and them apparently bailing on it the first chance they get. So yes, I doubt this is the last we'll hear of it, and I don't envy the Nokia people in France who have to manage this process, because I doubt it's going to be straightforward. Okay, cool. I will move it on to Huawei. We always, when we're discussing, just so our audience knows, we do actually discuss what we're going to talk about before we start recording. We don't just dial in and start winging it, although we largely do. But there's a tiny bit of preparation and discussion. And nearly always there's been, what I do is I look at which stories are the most read last week, which stories interested me the most last week. Obviously asked Jamie and Ian which ones caught their eye. And nearly always Huawei's near the top, because it's just always in the news. And so it's with a slightly heavy heart each time we talk about them, because we know we've done it a million times before. But there were some interesting developments last week, which were interesting in their own right and in the broader context of all the geopolitical aggro that's going on. So I'm going to, certainly for Telecoms.com, they were largely covered by Jamie. So I'm going to hand over to Jamie and say, why don't you start with the development in Canada, but then you can also talk about Brazil if you want.
Yeah, well, the Canadian one was effectively sort of Huawei's last chance to sort of be in at the races anywhere in North America. So TELUS outlined that they're suppliers for 5G RAN, and obviously this is the North America is in the US is effectively banned from doing any meaningful work with the major telcos, and Bell and Rogers in Canada have already outlined their plans with Nokia and Ericsson. So TELUS was sort of last throw the dice, and unfortunately for Huawei, it resulted in Samsung, Ericsson, and Nokia picking up contracts. Obviously, the North America is very, very different from South America, so the fortunes are very different there. South America is another market where incredibly price sensitive, primarily due to low ARPU, but also the vast amount of work which needs to be done to roll out any form of 4G network, let alone 5G network. So this is traditionally somewhere where Huawei and ZTE have been particularly successful, as well as Ericsson, when I think they tend to drop their pants occasionally. But then it's a market for the Open RAN community. And the US have tried to muscle Huawei out of Brazil by offering the Brazilian government basically financing options to build their own 4G network on the condition that Huawei is excluded from the market. But I can't see it being very successful here, because there's a lot more to consider than the money for 4G networks. First of all, you've got to consider where the existing operations in Brazil. There's a 2,000 person base station plant just outside Sao Paulo. So not only is that directly involved with employing 2,000 people, but it's also the development of a local supply chain in Sao Paulo in Brazil. And in the future, Huawei has promised to develop 1,000 person smartphone manufacturing plant in Brazil as well. So that's again, a thousand jobs directly, and enough stimulus to develop a local ecosystem for 5G devices for the South American region. So you got the Brazilian government there that's either got to take direct investment for a network, or it's got to turn its back on 3 to 10,000 direct and indirect jobs, let's say, plus the cost effectiveness of Huawei equipment in the market itself. I just can't see the Americans sort of trying to effectively bribe or blackmail financially, sort of cozy up to the Brazilian government being anywhere near as successful as it has been elsewhere.
No, and there's another factor within that, which is China's not averse to dangling a financial carrot in front of other countries to incentivize them to play ball with the Chinese way of doing things. And if I was the States, I wouldn't want to get into a direct bidding war with a direct sort of bribery bidding war with China, because China seems to have almost limitless resources for that sort of thing. And of course, its government is not is not openly accountable to its electorate for its spending. So, I mean, it could be good for Brazil if you've got the Americans and the Chinese bidding against each other to bribe Brazil into using certain kit vendors. Some Brazilian politicians presumably going to end up with a nice new super yacht. No, only joking, as if I'd suggest such a thing. So yes, that's an interesting development there. And then the one other thing before I invite Ian to comment on any of this stuff. Yeah, one thing I wrote not pretty soon after, Jamie, your story in Canada, was a development which isn't directly a telecoms thing at all, but is definitely part of the sort of macro narrative of a couple of Canadian citizens they were basically, so the big link, apart from whether or not Canada uses Huawei kit, obviously we've got the story of, I keep forgetting her name, but the CFO of Huawei, who's Ren's daughter, she got arrested. Sorry, what's her name? Meng. What's the other bit? Meng Wanzhou. Okay, well, we haven't got a way around to correct us at the moment. Yeah. Okay. So Meng Wanzhou got arrested 18 months ago, because they reckoned that years ago she conspired to get around US sanctions and something or other. And there are extradition process underway to extradite her from Canada to America. And obviously Huawei's not happy about this, and China is taking it pretty personally. And has definitely put pressure on Canada in the intervening 18 months to back down, which Canada hasn't done. Now, within days of her getting arrested at the start of start of 2019, a couple of Canadian people got arrested, and I don't think they were even charged with anything for ages. And now, finally, 18 months later, that's it. And Meng just lost one phase of her appeal against extradition. And then within days of her losing that appeal, China just charged these two Canadians with some kind of generic spying or general shiftiness type of accusation. And I don't think you have to be the most cynical person in the world to see a direct link between that and the fact that the Chinese state seems willing to basically use the arrest of people on. I have no idea whether these guys did any spying. Obviously, everyone in Canada and not on the Chinese side insists they're completely innocent, including their employers. And if we assume they are, then just basically kidnapping people in order to use them as geopolitical pawns is appalling behavior. And it doesn't seem to have worked, and it's just going to sour things even more. Meng is going through proper due process. I suppose if I was Chinese, I would think, due process, like there's any doubt that she's going to get extradited and charged and imprisoned. And they'd be entitled to such cynicism. But I just think, as a little aside, that move by China on those two Canadians, if they are innocent, and the charges, and there is no evidence against them, is just appalling.
And not to mention the conditions they're in. I mean, it's getting even more off the topic, but I think her arrest is, I mean, she's in her big mansion, isn't she, in Vancouver with a bracelet on, able to go out and about. And she can't see her family, obviously, and travel back home, which is not nice for anybody, but it's not, it's not a particularly tough place to be. Whereas I think the reports are saying these guys are in sort of windowless cells, being deprived of sleep every now and again with fluorescent lighting and all this kind of stuff. So yeah, it's not telecom related, but like you say, pretty appalling.
Yeah, I think so. And I just, every time one of these things happen, every time we talk about it, it seems more inevitable that this is just going to get worse and worse. It's kicking off. It's kicking off properly between China and India right now. I don't know if you saw. There's a bizarre story. I mean, while we're being off topic, we might as well have some fun. There's a bizarre story of Chinese and Indian soldiers getting it on with sort of improvised clubs and stuff, like something out of The Walking Dead, like bats with barbed wire wrapped around them and stuff. It's just bizarre. So yes, that broader theme that we talk about with balkanization, with a potential new Cold War, albeit with different characteristics, hopefully less overtly military than the last Cold War, does seem to be kicking off, and none of it bodes particularly well for Huawei. But there you go. Do either of you two have anything else to add on the sort of Huawei developments before I move on?
The India thing's interesting that you brought up at the end, because there's been a few developments there in the last probably week, or is it 2 weeks? But I mean, I think they've moved and said they're the kind of state-owned telcos there, BSNL and MTNL.
Good spot.
It's always unclear whether that's one company or two now, because they are supposed to be merging. But
I just call them MSNBC.
Yeah, but they're not. They've been told not to buy Chinese equipment, I think, and it still seems to be quite up in the air whether the private sector companies like Jio and Vodafone and what's the other one? Jamie's going to tell me now. Airtel are allowed to do that. So it's all a bit hazy, their own involvement. But this is really, the balkanization theme, I think, is really very noticeable in that market in particular, because you've even got Jio now stepping forward with plans to sort of develop its own kit. They're another one of these operators that seems to be at the forefront of this trend to try and do your own thing a little bit more, a little bit like Rakuten, I suppose. And there's a Vietnamese company called Vietel that's doing this as well. That's trying.
And I saw, sorry to butt in here, and I don't know how involved in this, but I saw a story by Anne Morris on Light Reading about a German operator looking at that.
Yeah, that's sort of related, I suppose. It's not in the Huawei sphere.
No, but in terms of going it alone or greenfield.
I mean, I think, so it's United Internet, which is a broadband operator in Germany, but they own a sub-brand called One and One Drillish, I think. It's probably not, it's not One and One, is it? I don't know what it is in German. I don't know.
There we are.
But they won the fourth license in the German 5G auction. And have been sort of had a few financial difficulties, I think, in terms of how they finance a rollout, and they're in negotiations with the other operators about national roaming and this kind of stuff. But they had an investor update last week in German where they basically said their plan is to use Open RAN. They're kind of going to do the same thing that Rakuten's done, and that we think Dish is going to do in the US, and use Open RAN technology to do this. They don't want to build with the three big guys, so that sort of rules out Huawei, Ericsson, Nokia. They haven't announced who their vendors are yet, but they're kind of on the lookout at the moment. So it's interesting in terms of that trying to sort of shift away from dependence on those big vendors, partly for geopolitical reasons, I think, but partly to sort of provide a spur to this new movement, I guess we could call it, Open RAN, that's partly is about developing your own technologies, I think, and becoming a bit more self-sufficient, and getting the cost attractions that go along with that as well. So it's another one. There's only three of these guys that I'm aware of now, really, in developed markets, trying to do stuff on the Open RAN front in a kind of big developed market.
Does seem to be growing, though.
It does, slowly. And it's interesting that you've got, because they're all three quite important markets. Obviously, Germany, Japan, the US are big economies. If these Open RAN companies, Open RAN operators, can come in and and if it can add up, if the maths works and the technology is reliable, and they can do what they sort of seem to want to do, which is to provide quite a low-cost service, undercut their rivals, but still be very profitable, it could really change things quite quickly, because the other companies are going to have to adapt to that, aren't they? And the only way to adapt, presumably, is to sort of go in the same direction. But it's a massive if, because there's all sorts of questions over Open RAN as well at the moment. But yeah, I thought the United Internet thing was really interesting last week.
Cool. Okay. I'm going to move it on to the last segment. So, I mean, this is where basically two things that interest me a lot and that are sort of mega topics within the broader tech world than just the telecoms world sort of collide. One is censorship and the other is big tech sort of monopoly, big tech dominance. And at the root of it was a story that was originally published by NBC, not MBNL, in the States, where they basically found that a couple of websites, what had they been doing? They'd just been doing some stuff that they thought was outside of the terms and conditions of Google, and they grassed them up, and Google appeared to suspend their monetization. Now, the reason this is, oh look, every time I say Google, my phone gets all excited. Shut up, you stupid thing. The reason this is a big deal in a monopolistic way is that Google controls a hell of a lot of digital advertising through its AdWords and various other things, beginning with these platforms. So a hell of a lot of people, unless they've got, like, for example, Telecoms.com might have an explicit ad deal with a vendor and we put a banner on the top. But if you don't have those sorts of deals, you can just sign up with AdWords and they will just serve the ads up. And that's a very efficient way of, especially smaller organizations or perhaps generalist media organizations, from getting a lot of revenue. So if Google starts kicking people off the AdWords platform because they have published stories that they don't like, then Google is in effect censoring those media. So my view, and the view of certainly a lot of politicians in the States, as ever in the States, everything's factual and polarized, and basically Republican conservative types share my view, and sort of liberal Democrat types don't. But I view this as not only an abuse of monopoly, but an attempt to censor open speech. So I spent a while just sort of mapping out all the stuff that was going on there. It looks like the reporter who grassed these sites up to Google is quite politically activist themselves, as some of their Twitter communication went for. I noted that Google can, depending on different reports, accounts for about half of all digital advertising in the States. And so all this turned into a big deal. And then before we knew it, you had senators writing in to say this is out of order, writing to Google. You had Brendan Carr from the FCC. He made a point. Sorry, this is a bit of a long monologue. I'll say this bit and then shut up. He made a point. He tweeted something saying, Google makes one of the strongest arguments yet for Section 230 reform. So it's worth just quickly recapping what he's referring to with Section 230. And that's specifically a section of something like a stupidly named law, like the Communications Decency Act. But what it addresses is a critical distinction for platforms, like for basically big internet platforms. It more specifically refers to social media, so Facebook, Twitter, but that would include stuff like YouTube and any other things that Google hosts that have comments on, that basically say that internet platforms are immune from liability for the comments that are made on their platform, which makes sense. You couldn't have a site like Twitter or Facebook where every time someone put something up, the platform was legally liable for what that person said. It would be impossible to edit in real time. So it's fine that they have those protections. In contrast, publishers such as Telecoms.com and Light Reading, we are liable for stuff that goes up on our site. So not only do we have to watch what we say when we publish our own things, but we got to keep an eye on what gets put on in the comments. So what they're basically saying is, you can't have it both ways, Google. You can't go around censoring people. It turned out that I've just remembered now. Sorry, I was sort of forgetting a bit at the start. That what these two sites, Zero Hedge and the Federalist, did wrong was on their comment section. It wasn't even stories they wrote. So they're saying, Google, you can't expect to be protected, your own comments section to be protected. Meanwhile, you go and unilaterally censor other sites for their comment section. So I'll shut up now. Ian, you seem to be about to interject.
Well, yeah, it's interesting, this, web giants and social media platforms doing this kind of self, policing themselves and censoring stuff and taking things down. And I'm just wondering whether, I know you've sort of laid out the rules there and how they should apply, but is there a concern that, because they do take a lot of flack, don't they, if something goes up that's deeply offensive? And we're getting into territory now of things that aren't even considered free speech, but instances of terrorism where someone sort of screamed what they're doing, and then it could be sort of watched by somebody who's on the other end of it. And I just wonder whether, the internet giants themselves are kind of concerned about the possibility of, they've overreacted sometimes. And we see this as kind of a theme emerging at the moment of them coming in and deciding to remove things or take something down or do something that angers free speech activists and people like us, I would say, But I'm just wondering from their perspective if they're just so kind of nervous about the legal ramifications of not doing something, and it's such a blurry area that they're overstepping the mark, but you can kind of see why they're overstepping the mark. I'm just trying to think about it from their perspective a little bit.
No,
because they're in such a difficult situation, and they're always in the public eye. They're always in the news. Mark Zuckerberg is, he's always being presented as a bit of a dweeb and a bit of a tosser or whatever. And he has to sort of show him, maybe that this is just something that it's like a social responsibility thing, but it's kind of gone beyond where it should be into a kind of nasty kind of Orwellian area sometimes.
Yeah, I think you're completely right to express sympathy for their position. Zuckerberg famously created Facebook in his dorm room at Harvard or wherever he was. They didn't expect to be the public town square for the whole world, but they are, whether they like it or not. Now they are in a very difficult position regarding censorship. Not only activist pressure, but more importantly for them, advertisers. Now, I wrote a story today about, I rather uncharitably framed it corporate virtue signaling. But personally, I'm not very impressed by corporations who try to pitch in on social and political causes. I think corporations, especially public corporations, everyone knows what their fiduciary responsibilities are. It's to maximize the returns for their investors, and for them to pretend that they're moral actors in the world, I don't find very plausible. But anyway, so they've got that. But advertisers do have a tendency to run screaming when they think there's some controversy, and this is happening more and more. Because, especially since we had all this stuff kicking off on the back of the guy getting killed by the police in the States, activism has got very extreme, I guess you could say. And that makes companies very worried because they just one little CSR, so that's corporate social responsibility, isn't it? That's what. They're just one little CSR slip away from a colossal PR catastrophe. So I have sympathy for them. I've got less time when they go really far the other way, like Ben and Jerry's going on about defund the police and that sort of thing. But I see why they need to protect their reputation. I've got a solution for that. But before I get into that, I haven't really invited Jamie in for a little while. Do you have any thoughts on this sort of balance of that social media have to strike with regard to censorship and with regard to whether they're a platform or a publisher or that sort of thing?
No, not really. Realistically, everyone's trying to paint them in a box that they really shouldn't do. The whole argument is fundamentally flawed from my perspective, because you're trying to push either, you're trying to push Facebook and Twitter into categories which were defined during the analog era prior to these big organizations being created. this is the problem with the vast majority of regulation and legislation today. It's built on foundations that are defined in eras that are completely different from what we have today. Like the Communications Act in pretty much every country is built on the Communications Act, which was passed in the 80s for wiretapping on normal phones, but that doesn't exist today because technology has moved on. Yet you're still trying to develop laws and clauses on top of this archaic regulation and legislative. So that's exactly the same thing that's happening with social media. I mean, people are pushing them towards saying, well, they're a platform, they're a publisher. Well, they're neither, because this is something that didn't exist when you were creating these binary rules and binary categories 20 years ago. So why are you trying to push something which is, I'm trying to think of a parallel example. I don't know, is an airplane a horse and carriage or a motor car in the 20s? I mean, it's neither. That's the same sort of thing, but they're the same. The two categories of transportation which existed before. You're trying to push them into two things that they're not. Yeah, they get you from A to B, but they're not the same thing. And that's fundamentally the flaw of this argument: is that you're trying to create Facebook. You're trying to label Facebook as something because it's convenient for the laws which already exist, as opposed to appreciating what Facebook is, how society has evolved from what it was 20 years ago, and creating rules and the foundation of legislature which can actually create a fair society in the future.
Yeah, I actually completely agree with everything you said. The only problem we got, as you made very clear, is we're not starting from the ideal position. We're starting from where we are now. I think there does need to be, in terms of law and regulation, a separate third category for public platforms that needs to acknowledge both sides of it. It needs to acknowledge the difficulty they have in policing their platform and in balancing a million different conflicting interests all flying at them at the same time. A thing I wrote today, there's a pressure group that's been created specifically to lobby for the boycott of advertising on Facebook because they're not happy with how Facebook has handled the whole censorship thing. And while they didn't explicitly say it, I've deduced that what they're not happy about is that Facebook's not censoring Trump more. Now, maybe Trump should be censored more, but is it for a bunch of pressure groups or a bunch of virtue signaling corporates to make the call on that? So it's all getting quite arbitrary. That's just one example of the pressure these people are under. On the flip side, they do make the platforms themselves do make quite a lot of arbitrary censorship decisions, not just in terms of things like that Google one of getting people off its ad platform, but obviously on social media, Twitter famously has recently started labeling some tweets from Donald Trump as having issues with them, leading to Trump to have one of his little tantrums. But they kick people off. That you get people getting kicked off for arbitrary things that are just to do with culture wars. Some woman got kicked off by questioning whether sex is fluid. Other people get kicked off for questioning, current political movements, which I'm not even going to get into because I'm a coward and I just can't be bothered to have that flagged up as one little issue that we talk about in this. So they're making a lot of arbitrary decisions. My short-term fix. So I completely agree with Jamie. We need a third category. We need an aeroplane category where currently we only have a horse and cart and car categories. That's a massive legal and regulatory undertaking. That doesn't mean it shouldn't happen, but there's no quick fix to that. My quicker fix that I would propose, if I had any power, which of course I don't, would be to make the protection from liability that social media companies currently enjoy contingent on them only censoring within the actual law rather than their own arbitrary terms and conditions. So, for example, Ian, that would cover your terrorism thing because the law already says that it's against the law to promote terrorism. So, but what they can't do is say, we're taking this thing down because we just think it's a bit upsetting. So that would be my short-term solution, pending the proper rejig, is make their protection contingent on them only censoring within the law. And I think that's quite a neat solution. I don't know, Jamie, you were pushing back. Does that make sense to you as a possible short-term fix?
No, it does. It does. I mean, my pushing back is just purely because the entire argument is flawed because they're setting themselves up to fail. I think that's about. I think clearly defining what to censor and what not to censor is a very, very reasonable approach. The I mean, like I said, my issue is it's fundamentally, and it's exactly the same every single way, everywhere, and every element of law in the technology world. When you look at cybersecurity and you look at the idea of seizing materials or gaining access to someone's phone, so in years gone. They had to pass regulation to say that a police could turn up with a warrant at your front door and search your home because they have physical information inside your home, and they wouldn't need your permission to do that. But now, for instance, they can go around and they don't actually have to seek the same sort of warrants because it's not on your physical premise that you own anymore. It's in the cloud. So, but they're trying to build these layers and layers and layers of new security to account and new security legislation to account for different developments in the technology world. And you just think to yourself, and then you get to a certain point where you're just like, you got this teetering sort of column of sort of clauses built on clauses built on clauses. And you're just like, well, all you need is someone to attack one thing at the very base and disprove that. And then all of a sudden you take down everything that's above it purely because the law relies on precedent, which is set on different bills and different acts and different clauses. So it just seems baffling to me that you wouldn't write a bill, a big communications bill, which is fit for the digital economy. They did it in the 80s because there was a massive shift in the 80s, wasn't there? People started using phones in a completely different way, and mobile phones started turning up in the late 80s, early 90s. That was a big, big shift in the way society developed. So they created massive new legislation for it. The same thing should be done today. They need massive regulatory and legislative revolution to redefine the building blocks of the digital economy.
Yeah, what you're describing is a metaphor I've had in my mind for a little while that I call the tower of sticking plasters. You get something that needs addressing, you put a sticking plaster over it rather than treating it properly. Then that sticking plaster needs another one over it, and another one, another one, and meanwhile, to perhaps overextend the metaphor, the underlying wound continues to fester because you haven't sewn it up. So yes, I completely agree with that. I mean, this is not the place, and we certainly don't have the time to get into why legislation is so gridlocked, but you just need to look at the state of politics in places like the UK and the US in terms of partisanship, in terms of how difficult it seems to be to get anything done. That's one clue, but I think we can all agree that they should do that. They should just start again. The world's changed a hell of a lot, and just putting in, even these, when I was covering it, even these Republicans like Ted Cruz and Josh Hawley, the stuff they come up with is just sticking plasters, just little tweaks. The only thing I can say is that maybe what they have to do, maybe the pragmatic way of getting things done in the States is to introduce a tiny little, almost cosmetic tweak as the thin end of the wedge. And then once you've set that precedent of being able to tweak that much, then you can introduce bigger and bigger tweaks. But that's just speculation. It could be nothing. So, we're running out of time. Ian, I haven't invited you to sort of talk any further on this matter of, it's a broad matter, not just of censorship, but obviously the designation of internet platforms and just broader big tech monopolies. Yeah, do you have any? It's just a big topic to throw at you for a last few minutes. But do you have any last thoughts?
It's only, I suppose, not really, not anything you haven't said. I mean, it's only because they're so big that we worry about this. If Facebook was a 200,000 person platform, then no one would be as wound up about it. But it's because it's an awkward thing for it to be a privately owned company and also be something that's used by billions and billions of people around the planet and is seen as, everybody sees Facebook as something they kind of own in a sense, isn't it? It's like you get up and you look at your page and you put things on it. And that's why everybody gets so wound up about this thing. It's like having one sort of giant pub where everybody's kind of shouting at each other. And
don't talk about pubs. It's too painful.
Yeah. Well, maybe not in a couple of weeks. Who knows?
Yeah. No, you're completely right. And that's the public town square thing. And this gets thrown back. I was having a debate with some friends of mine, some of whom are decidedly lefty, and they did the whole private company thing and threw that at me. And I couldn't help a snarky response going, "Oh, it's funny how socialists are suddenly all keen on private companies when it supports their agenda." But there does come a time. This is what people forget, and this goes all the way back to Adam Smith in the late 1700s, where he talked about cartels. There does come a time where the state, in the form of regulation or law or both, does need to is correct for it to intervene in private enterprise, because private enterprise, given half the chance, will form monopolies and screw over the public. So yes, you cannot have a functioning free market. Anyone who's a free market absolutist who just believes in pure economic Darwinism, I think, is deluded. You cannot have a properly functioned free market without regulation, just because of human nature.
Yeah, I agree with that. Yeah.
Cool. All right, then. I think we'll wrap it up there. We've probably done about an hour, so we'll leave it there. Thanks a lot, guys. It's going to be a nice hot week this week. I expect Jamie to be even more glowing by the end of this week. So thanks a lot for joining us, and thanks a lot for watching, and make sure you join us for the next one.